West Florida Public Library presents Explore Pensacola History, a lecture series highlighting more than 450 years of Escambia County's history. Join us as we explore the people, places, and events that make up our area's unique heritage. Major funding for Explore Pensacola History was provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities Council with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Humanities Council or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Friends of West Florida Public Library, whose ongoing generosity provides these and other first-class programs to the people of Escambia County. For more information or to become a friend of the library, visit them online at friendsofwfpl.org.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone coming out this evening. Can you all hear me okay? I've got two microphones on me, so I'm kind of wired for bear up here. So if you can't hear me, let me know. I can speak a little bit louder. But thanks again for coming out. I want to thank the library for the wonderful invitation, and we appreciate it. Can you hit the lights? Dim the lights just a hair? So a little bit about FPAN. Mike told you Florida Public Archaeology Network. I'm the Associate Director, and if you've not heard of us, we're actually part of the University of West Florida, and we do education and outreach in archaeology. We have 8 regional offices around the state that does that. And a lot of what we do are presentations and things like this. And I encourage you, we've got a little table over here with lots of handouts and goodies and giveaways, so please feel free to peruse that and take home anything that strikes your fancy. So let's talk about shipwrecks. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And I've been very fortunate to be able to study shipwrecks here in Pensacola for a long time, as well as other places. But I think Pensacola, with our bay, we have one of the best laboratories for studying historic shipwrecks anywhere in the world. And so before I talk about shipwrecks, I always like to talk about ships. And I think that this is a great way to talk about it. You know, who doesn't love Pirates of the Caribbean? It's one of my favorite movies. But this is a fantastic quote. This is when Captain Jack and Elizabeth were marooned on the island, and he's talking about the Black Pearl. And he says, that's what a ship is, you know. It's not just a keel and a hull and deck and sails. That's what a ship needs. But what a ship really is freedom. And I think that's an interesting way to think about ships as bridges to the past and what ships represent, as well as what shipwrecks represent. Because a shipwreck is not just ballast and timbers and fasteners. That's what a shipwreck needs. But what a shipwreck really is clues to the human past. And as archaeologists, that's what we're after. You know, it's not the things we find, it's what those things tell us about the people who made them and used them, and in this case, left them on the ship when they wrecked, unfortunately. But shipwrecks can tell us about lots of things. It can tell us about lifeways, what people thought was important enough to pack on board a ship to continue their way of life at sea. It can tell us about trade and commerce. What do you pack on board that ship to take somewhere else to trade it for something that you don't have? It can tell us about navigation and how sailors found their way. You know, early navigators found their way across the trackless ocean by following the shoreline. Eventually, they've realized celestial navigation will get you where you're going. You can get out of the side of the shore. And we can see ancient maritime routes by the shipwrecks that kind of litter the open ocean. They tell us about colonization and movement. You know, what inspires somebody to pack everything they own, you know, their family and their kids and their dogs and all their clothes and their cooking utensils, pack them aboard a ship and go across the ocean to start a new way of life somewhere else. Ships tell us about warfare as well. Ships carried war just as certainly as they carried cargo, and we see that in the development of early ocean-going ships. The big forecastles and stern castles were originally platforms for archers to fire down into enemy ships. Ships carried disease. The Black Plague that ravaged Europe in the 1300s got to Europe from Asia on fleas, on rats, on ships, and we can see the spread of the plague through Europe from the port cities where these ships came in. Ships carried language, they carried culture, they carried ideas, they carried songs and tales and folklore, information. Ships carried all these things. And we can get at that and learn about the people who made them, who used them, who wrecked on them, who sometimes died on them, unfortunately. And all the artifacts that these ships contain tell us a piece of that story. And that's why shipwrecks are so important archaeologically. They're a time capsule. In a way, they're kind of the only time capsule we have to get to the past. They're sort of a microcosm, a little mini piece of the culture that created them and the people that sailed on them. They also are often what archaeologists call a closed context. That means that everything on that ship we know was in use at one moment in time. We don't tend to see shipwrecks stacked one on top of another like we sometimes see land sites, which makes it very confusing to figure out which artifacts can go with which time period. Occasionally we do see ships. Sometimes there are places we call ship traps. You know, there's a treacherous shoal or a reef, and ships kind of tend to wreck in the same place, but that's pretty uncommon. Ships also provide excellent preservation, and what you see on the bottom right there are the bones of the black rat. And these came from one of the Tristan de Luna shipwrecks in Pensacola Bay that we'll talk about in a moment. Incidentally, that's the earliest evidence of the black rat in North America, right here in Pensacola, you guys. Oh, yeah. But these wonderful little bones often don't survive on land archaeological sites, especially around here. The soil's too acidic. Those little bitty bones get eaten up in the soil. But in an anaerobic environment, which means like thick mud where there's no oxygen, so there's no bacteria, these bones are beautifully preserved, along with other kinds of organics like shoe soles, pieces of rope, pieces of textile, really amazing things that we often don't find on land. But you know, shipwrecks are also very important biologically. If you guys live around the water, you know, anything that winds up in the water pretty soon is going to be colonized by some sort of critter. You know, algae starts growing on it, that attracts little fish, that attracts the oysters that will adhere onto it. Pretty soon you've got an ecosystem on whatever is sunk. And we see that on historic shipwrecks. All of these photos you see there are historic shipwrecks around Florida. And in some cases they're some of the oldest artificial wrecks around, and they have created very vibrant ecosystems. And so something I always try to explain, especially when I talk to like dive shops or dive clubs, is that if you think about, you know, oh, I don't want a piece of this shipwreck or take an artifact off this shipwreck for a souvenir, well, number one, not only are you removing a piece of the puzzle of the past, but you're also damaging something's house, because I can guarantee you there's a whole lot of animals that live on these sites. Sometimes they get in our way. That middle picture on the right there is a toadfish, or we sometimes call them a mother-in-law fish, and they bite. So what's the problem? Well, there's a lot of problems with shipwrecks and the issues that surround them. First thing is a false perception of wrecks. That kind of top right photo there, you know, people often think of shipwrecks as the entire vessel sitting on the bottom with the mast standing and the sails billowing and the currents and skeletons lashed to the wheel. And that's, you know, unfortunately not what we find. We kind of call that the Disneyfication of shipwrecks. Very rarely do we find whole ships, and they have to be, wooden ships especially, they have to be in very specific kind of environment, like cold, deep water in the Great Lakes, or water that's cold and has a very high saline content, like in the Baltic Sea, which means that the salt is so high that shipworms and other little critters that eat the wood can't survive. And occasionally there we do find whole wooden shipwrecks. They're incredible. But mostly what we find are the very bottoms of the ships. Over time, kind of the upper works tend to get worn away. They're eaten by little critters, the wood, or they're knocked apart by storms or waves. And then they eventually get covered over by sediment. And so whatever's kind of locked in place by the sediment is typically what we find. But that's okay, because the very bottom of the hull, number one, can tell us a whole lot about the construction techniques of these ships. But that's often where a lot of the artifacts end up. They kind of fall down in the ship and work their way down into the bottom of the hold. So that's all right. Shipwrecks are also out of sight, out of mind for a large percentage of the population. How many folks in here dive? Only a few. So you folks can probably see some shipwrecks, but for the rest of you, it may take a while for you can actually go see them yourself. I have visions in my head of future public archaeologists, you know, driving submersibles and taking people. I'd like to do that. But you can see them now virtually. You know, the World Wide Web has given us a fantastic tool, but really they're out of sight, out of mind for a lot of folks. Not only average people like you and me, but also the legislators and the lawmakers. They don't think about shipwrecks either. And so very often, the laws that might protect a site on land aren't so protective of sites underwater. There's also sort of a finders keepers mentality. For some reason, people seem to think that if it's underwater, it's up for grabs. And if you find it, you get to take it. But the reality is that these shipwrecks in state or federal waters are protected by the same laws that protect sites on land on state or federal lands. It's the same thing. But also visitor behavior is not monitored. You know, there's no diving park rangers that are, you know, their job is to sit at a shipwreck site and kind of watch people as they go around and not cross the velvet rope. You know, that'd be a cool job if it existed, but unfortunately it doesn't. So, you know, somebody who might not, you know, take a little thing on land, you know, look around underwater, there's no one watching them, they might take a little thing, unfortunately. And also there's a disconnect between land and sea. You know, someone who would never dream of going to Mount Vernon and chipping a brick out of the side of Mount Vernon to take it home and put on their mantle might not think twice about going to a historic shipwreck and chipping a porthole out of the side of it to take home and put on their mantle. But it's the same thing. You just have to think of these sites, you know, they're maybe in a different environment, but they're historically important to all of us as part of our maritime heritage just the same. I always like to point out what the photo there on the bottom left, Treasure Hunter's Map of Florida. That's actually a placemat. And I picked that up in a little seafood restaurant down in Fort Pierce, which is what we call the Treasure Coast of Florida. It's where the 1715 Plate Fleet wrecked, and coins still wash up on the beach occasionally after storms. And so I was sitting there waiting for my grouper sandwich, and I was reading that. And you see it's very text heavy, and basically every word on there is nonsense. There is not one thing on there that is correct about Florida's historic shipwrecks. And yet that's the information that our citizens and visitors get about these really important historic sites. So as archaeologists, as cultural resource managers, a lot of what we do is kind of fight against this propaganda, this misinformation, because I think the real story of Florida shipwrecks is a lot more interesting. So the threats to these historic sites are myriad. Everything from looting, people intentionally looting these sites to get things to sell on eBay. Souvenir collecting, divers who just kind of aren't really aware and they think, oh, I just want a piece of this ship to take home to remind me of this dive, but they don't realize, if everybody who visited the site took a piece, pretty soon there's going to be nothing left. And then why are you going to want to dive there? Or why are your kids or grandkids going to want to dive there? We also see lots of inadvertent human impact. Divers who can't really control their buoyancy real well, or they get caught in surge and they grab onto the side, or they drop an anchor on it. Also, things that we really can't do a whole lot about, like erosion from wake and runoff and boat motors, development. That bottom left picture, that's West Palm Beach there, you guys. And where people like to live along our coasts hundreds and thousands of years ago is where people like to live today. And so we're losing our coastal sites at a really alarming rate. And then also offshore industry that's growing. There's oil and gas exploration, there's trawling, there's aggregates mining, there's wind farms. All of these things can affect these sites underwater. So it's really a challenge to try to protect what we have and learn about it before it's gone. So that's a little bit of kind of the background of ships and shipwrecks and why as archaeologists we're so excited about them. Let's talk about shipwrecks here in our bay. And this is an early Spanish map of Pensacola Bay, 1698, and you can see the Spanish, even from the earliest explorations, had a really good handle on what our bay looked like. You can pick out there the Gulf Breeze Peninsula and Garcon Point, and it's really a wonderful map. And so they had a really good idea of what our bay looked like, and we're very fortunate that they dropped shipwrecks for us pretty regularly. Our earliest shipwrecks that we know of course, are what we call the Emanuel Point ships. And these are associated with the 1559 expedition of Tristan de Luna y Ariano, who tried to settle Pensacola, one of the first colonization attempts of what is today the United States. He had quite a large expedition, 11 vessels, 1,500 people, including men, women, and children. He had Aztec Indian mercenaries. He had African slaves. And they had all the tools, supplies, equipment, everything they needed to build a whole new colony, a new settlement here on the edge of the Spanish Empire. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for them, and they were hit by a hurricane, which wiped out the chances for success of the colony. We didn't look for the ships until 1992, and we still haven't found Luna's land site. All archaeologists kind of think we have an idea of where it might be, but it's not been discovered, but we have found a couple of his ships. Here's a hurricane, much like this one, hit them. And of course, they didn't have Jim Cantori to come to their town and tell them they were doomed, so they really had no idea that the hurricane was coming. And it's an incredible account of the aftermath of this hurricane and the colonists trying to kind of pick up the pieces. They ended up wandering into the interior trying to get food from the natives. They were unsuccessful and finally were evacuated, most back to Mexico or back to Cuba. The ships themselves, of course, were here. Several of them were wrecked. 7 of them were destroyed. 1 of them was blown inland. They say an arquebus shot, which is about 300 yards, and they were able to salvage materials from that. The other 6 were wrecked in the bay. At least a couple of them we know in fairly shallow water, and so we know they were pretty heavily salvaged. The others we haven't found yet, although they may be very close by. There's X marks a spot of where the Emanuel Point ships are, kind of near the entrance to Bayou Tahar. And that's a real nice place. There's high land there from that little point there, what's now East Hill. You can see up and down the bay. You can see all the way to the pass on a clear day. You can see who else is coming in. There's nice fresh water that flows into Bayou Tahar. There's good holding ground there. I kind of think his land settlement may have been close by, although that's certainly not been proven. And there's a nice aerial there of what we call Emanuel Point. And you can see kind of on that top left where it kind of goes from dark water to light water, and that's a sandbar. It goes from about 18 feet right up to about 10 feet, real fast. And that's where these ships are located, where they pounded on this sandbar. We found this vessel in 1992 through a grant. I was working for the Department of State's Bureau of Archaeological Research as part of the Pensacola Shipwreck Survey, and our job was to survey Pensacola Bay for historic wrecks. And I always wanted to drain the bay. No one will let me do that. But I think if we could drain the bay, we'd see where all of these sites are. Instead, we were using a magnetometer, which is kind of like a big underwater metal detector that you drag behind a boat. And we ran over this spot kind of near Emanuel Point, right off Bayou Tahar one day, and the mag defaulted. It went off the scale. So we knew there was something big and metal on the bottom. And as we dove down and started looking around, we found a large pile of ballast. And ballast is really anything heavy you put in the bottom of a ship. It lowers its center of gravity, helps it sail more stable. And so, where there's lots of ballast mounds in Pensacola Bay, we found a lot. Ships would come in and dump off ballast to take on loads of cargo. So there's lots of just random ballast mounds. But we started digging under the ballast to see if there were any timbers, and that's what we found. And what you see on the bottom right there, and I apologize, it's a very dark slide, but the water there is very dark. The drawing on the left is what that is of, and that's the main mast step of a 16th century Spanish shipwreck. They built their ships in a very particular way, and so when we started finding these construction techniques, we got very excited and called our boss, Dr. Roger Smith, who was then and is still the state underwater archaeologist, and Roger's one of the world's leading experts on these early Iberian ships. And so at that point, we changed from survey looking for ships to excavating this one. And the University of West Florida became involved the next year. So lots of wonderful artifacts. Starting from the top left, we'll go clockwise. There's olive pits, hundreds and hundreds of olive pits. The next thing there is a mortar and pestle for grinding up like medicines or spices. The next is a wonderful little carving of a Spanish galleon. And fits in your hand. It's a little flat piece of wood that's perfectly carved, and it was found right down on that mast step, and we're not sure why it was there. Someone may have laid it over in the ship when they were building it. The next one down, those are stone cannonballs about the size of a grapefruit, chipped by hand out of chunks of limestone. And the idea was they would fire these and they would hit the enemy ship and shatter like shrapnel, taking out personnel and rigging. Below that is the one coin we have found. People like to say, oh, have you found treasure? And we like to say, well, yes, historical treasures, but one coin. And the interesting thing about this one, it's actually one, it's split open during conservation, but that allowed us to see the design on the inside. And this is actually a coin called a blanca. It was minted in Spain between 1471 and 1474. Now, when did Columbus reach the New World? 1492. So what is a coin from before the time of Columbus doing on a shipwreck in Pensacola Bay? Well, the answer is we don't know, as is often the case in archaeology. Probably what happened, the ship was actually pretty old when it made the voyage to Pensacola. We can tell that from evidence of wear and a lot of repairs to the hull. And so probably this coin was lost in the ship long before it came to Pensacola. Someone else had the idea that maybe it was someone's lucky pocket piece or something, in which case it didn't do him any good because the ship sank. But nevertheless, it was right down in the bottom. Moving to the left there, that's mercury, over 7 pounds of mercury, which we did not immediately tell EPA about when we found it. But it was right down in the bottom of the ship. They were importing mercury. They used it for two reasons. The Spanish used mercury for treating venereal disease. But the other thing they used it for was a process called amalgamation, which separates gold and silver from the ore that it's found in. And there's a long process that you mix the ore with the mercury and the little flecks stick to it and you burn it off, which is real poisonous, so you have your Indian slaves do that. But you end up with pure gold and silver. So the Spanish under Luna were hoping to find mines of gold and silver here in Pensacola, just like they had found in Central and South America. I mean, why not? They'd found it in other places in the New World. We know they didn't, of course. There's none of that around here, but they were coming prepared. We found one whole plate, beautiful glazed ceramic, a type called mahalica, probably used in the captain's cabin. Another kind of ceramic, the next one up that you see there, molded in the shape of a human face. This is a kind called Aztec 4 and was used by the Aztec natives of Central America. And so we knew that he had Aztec Indian mercenaries with him as kind of a security detail, and they were bringing the ceramics they were familiar with. And then in the middle there is our rat bones, which we love. Those are just the coolest things ever. Hundreds and hundreds of rat bones. We had them analyzed by a rat bone expert, and there are, in fact, such people. And he told us that they were growing up deformed by a disease called rickets, which is a bone deformity caused by lack of vitamin D. So these rats were living in the hold of the ship and never coming out into the light of day, and they were growing up kind of deformed. There also is evidence of cannibalism, little gnaw marks on the bones from other rats. See, all kinds of cool things you can find out. So this is about what the ship looked like. The first one, Emanuel Point 1, we call it, was a larger galleon of the fleet, a store ship probably, about 80 to 100 feet long. About 40% of it has been excavated. And at that point, we decided, you know what, let's leave it alone. We had a whole lot of artifacts that we needed to take care of in the lab, a lot of analysis and writing. We also figure as archaeologists that future archaeologists are going to have much better tools and techniques than we do today. Think about DNA analysis. Who would have thought 50 years ago you would be able to extract ancient DNA from brain material and perform analysis on it? So I have to think in 50 or 100 or 200 years, archaeologists will be able to do this a lot better than we can. In the meantime, the university continued the search for the rest of Luna's ships, and in 2006 found a second one, about 400 yards from the first one. We call it EP2. And it's a smaller vessel, about half the size of the first one, but it's really interesting because we can compare the artifacts that it was carrying to the artifacts that were on the bigger ship, try to determine lading practices, if they were carrying different things on the smaller vessels and the larger vessels. And a wonderful array of artifacts has come from that one as well. Lots more ceramics, lead sheathing that was helping to keep the hull watertight and the weed off of it. One more possible coin. It's still in conservation. It could be a button. We're not real sure what that one is yet. And then also more rat bones, but is also a skull from the ship's cat, which makes me very sad. But they did have cats on board. So moving on to more Spanish shipwrecks. Those are the earliest ones we know of, but the Spanish continued to leave shipwrecks for us. They were very accommodating. Another very important one is one that's from a couple hundred years later. We call it the Santa Rosa Island wreck, but we think it was called Nuestra Senora de Rosario y Santiago Apostol, which is why we call it the Santa Rosa Island wreck. Was wrecked probably in 1705, also in a hurricane. It was a flagship of the Windward Fleet. It had come in to take on a load of timber, especially for ships' masts. They were going to go take them back to Mexico for the big shipbuilding industry that had developed in Mexico. It was sunk in a hurricane while it was anchored and actually broke in half. We know from historical documents that it literally broke in half, so there was no chance of salvaging this thing. It was first found during the Pensacola Shipwreck Survey, also in '92, but UWF did a pretty thorough investigation in 1999. And it's down near Santa Rosa Island. You see it kind of on the north side of the island. It's not too far from Battery Langdon, kind of on the deep slope there. And because it's on that nice slope near the entrance to the bay, we get some really nice visibility there. A lot different than up at Emanuel Point. And so you can see some excavation techniques there. You know, just like our colleagues on land, we excavate the same way in square holes. We use excavation units. We very carefully go down in layers, recording everything that we uncover. You know, archaeology is a destructive science. Once you dig a site, you can never really redig it. So you've got to take all the careful notes, drawings, measurements, photos, videos, everything you can, with the idea that a colleague could literally rebuild that site on paper. That's what we're going for. And some wonderful artifacts from that one as well. It was carrying a lot of extra materials. Top left there are a pile of pulley shivs. You know, those are the runners in the middle of a block and tackle, you know, that the rope runs on. And these show no evidence of wear, so it was probably spares that they were carrying. On the top right there, that's actually a stack of brooms, of all things. So they were carrying lots of brooms. And then we found this wooden chest, and everyone got real excited. But we had it x-rayed, and it was full of nails. Well, that's usually the case. So lots of fasteners also, is carrying extra nails and fasteners also. But the material, the wood on this one, the timber, was really beautifully preserved. All again buried in the mud and the sand, been protected from teredo worms, shipworms, and it was just really amazing preservation there. And a lot of the pieces of this ship had been built in the New World of mahogany, and so the wood still kind of glowed red when we uncovered it. So really amazing preservation there. Moving right along into the British period. The British came in, 1763 to 1783, only here for 20 years, but affected Pensacola quite a lot. The layout of our streets we see today is straight from the British period, and expanded the fort of Pensacola. And of course, England, being a maritime nation, they had lots of ships here kind of helping to expand their maritime nation and run trade, as well as bring in personnel and settlers and materials, cargo. And so fortunately, the British also left a couple of shipwrecks for us. And this is the first British wreck that was discovered in Pensacola Bay. It was a sloop of war. We call it the Deadman's Island wreck. It's over off Deadman's Island near Gulf Breeze. Probably it's either HMS Stork or HMS Florida, and they were both little survey sloops. And we know from historical documents they were used in Pensacola. They were both taken to Deadman's Island, which was a careening ground. These wooden ships, they start to grow weed and they need repairs, and so they'd have to be careened, which is basically you run them up into shallow water, tip them over on their side, you scrape down and clean one side, you tip them on the other side and do the same thing. So we see careenages in harbors all over the New World, certainly in the Old World, wherever there's warm water and ships have to be repaired. And the area around Deadman's Island, called Old Navy Cove, was where they did the careening. It had deep water that came up close to shore, and then a nice sloping sandy bank up to the shore. So it's a perfect place for a careenage. And we know that they took both of these vessels into the careenage to repair them, found them both to be unseaworthy, and left them. So one is HMS Stork, one is HMS Florida. We know where the other one is. We call it the Town Point wreck. So one's one, but we don't know which one is which name, unfortunately. Maybe eventually through some comparison of construction records, we'll be able to tell which one is which. It was first recorded by UWF in 1988 during a survey of dead mans, and then the university's very first underwater archaeology field school recorded it in detail in 1989. And there again, X marks a spot there right near, right off the end of the Gulf Breeze Peninsula off Deadman's. And here's a lovely area. You see, it's in very shallow water. All those little figures there in blue are students, one of whom was me. That was my very first underwater field school. And it was a fantastic site to learn underwater archaeology, because if you had a question, you stood up and you asked your question. Literally, it's in about hip-deep water. And what you see there is the side of the vessel, the port side of the ship. And so it was a wonderful place to learn about ship construction, about these early colonial ships. Now, unfortunately, it was vandalized in 1990. Some people who think, all of Florida shipwrecks must be covered in gold and silver got out there and ripped it apart looking for non-existent treasure. So unfortunately, the Deadman's Island wreck is gone. There's not really much left of it, unfortunately. But we did get some good archaeology done on it, and so it can live on in its archaeological reports. So moving along, Catherine, here's another one. This is one of the shipwrecks, that you hear about ships like Titanic or Mary Rose or, some of these, Vasa, some of these famous shipwrecks, of history. You never hear about ships like Catherine, and yet Catherine, the kinds of ships like this are what really made our state grow, as well as really kind of the whole United States, especially around the seaboard. This is one of those workhorse tramp cargo haulers. It picked up cargo wherever it was needed. It took it somewhere else. It stimulated the economy. And it came to be wrecked and kind of was forgotten about, and nobody really thinks about it. But it's really an interesting ship and helped to lead to the development of our community, certainly. It was launched in 1870, called Eliza, was later renamed Carnarvonshire. Wooden hulled, 3 masts, that's a picture of her there on the right, so we know what she looked like. And she was eventually renamed Catherine in 1890 and sold to a Norwegian shipping company, which was pretty common. The Norwegians had a big tradition of buying sort of older sailing vessels. They would literally work them until they ran aground, they sprung a leak, they became unseaworthy, literally kind of wringing the last bit of economic value out of them that they could. In 1894, she was coming into Pensacola Bay in ballast, which means that she only had ballast. She wasn't carrying a cargo. She was going to come in and pick one up when she was caught in a gale and wrecked. And this is a fantastic photo that's completely staged. What you see there, yes, absolutely. The actual story is better. Where it wrecked off of the south side of Santa Rosa Island was kind of near where the life-saving station was. And the life-saving station keeper, and his 2 teenage daughters actually rescued all of the people on the boat, all of the men on the boat. Everybody made it off very safely. They even managed to go back and get their personal effects. But then later on, this wonderful photograph of manly men doing manly things was staged in front of the wreck. But it's a fantastic photograph nevertheless. And that's where she is, kind of just on the outside. And it's a nice shallow water, and sometimes it covers with sand, sometimes it uncovers. The last time it was really uncovered, about 10 years ago, UWF students got after it. A wonderful master's thesis was written on it. And it was completely recorded. It was what we call composite built, which means that it had some wooden parts and some metal parts. Most of the hull was wood, but those big masts were iron. And you can still see those big masts kind of laying in place out there. Some wonderful artifacts from it as well, even though it's in shallow water and was really heavily salvaged at the time, including on the top left there, the compass binnacle. That was actually discovered by some local divers who saw it and realized that they had found something interesting. They called the university, who was able to recover it and put it in conservation. Now it's at the Archaeology Institute, and anybody can go and see it. And it's a wonderful, large brass binnacle. And we know her name was Carnarvonshire because we also found her nameplate. We don't usually find that, but on the bottom right there, that's her nameplate. Across the top, it says Carnarvonshire, and around the bottom, Liverpool. So it's been a popular dive site for a long time, and folks still go out there. It's a shore dive if you can catch it when it's uncovered. It's really pretty nice. A lot of sea life. Hamilton's wreck is a remnant of our fantastic fishing industry. We call it Hamilton's. We don't know its name, although it probably looked like this little snapper smack here, discovered by a resident named Frank Hamilton, so we named it after him. He showed us where the site was. It's only about 63 feet long. It's wooden hulled, 2 masts, probably look just like that one, and likely associated with the fishing industry, and we know that based on its construction as well as the artifacts that we found on it. May very well have sunk in one of the big 6 hurricanes that hit Pensacola in either 06, 26, maybe as late as 36, but that's pretty late for these kinds of sailing vessels. But it's over kind of near Bayou Grande and the flats out there, and again, it was a wonderful site for a field school, and that's what it was, a target of a field school and then also a master's thesis from UWF. And you can see the outline of the timbers there just in about waist deep water, so a really wonderful site for students. And again, wonderful artifacts, and it really is, these artifacts are interesting to me because there are a lot of personal hygiene artifacts found on the vessel. You think of, these fishermen as going offshore and they're, dirty and whatever, but we found like straight razors and toothbrushes, of course whiskey jugs, they were fishing. But also this wonderful thing is a jar of Pompeian massage cream for making your complexion white and soft. So somebody was very concerned about his appearance on board the vessel there. And Massachusetts, this is one of my favorite shipwrecks here. This is the nation's oldest battleship, and it's sunk right here off Pensacola. It was built in 1893 as part of the New Steel Navy. It's a pre-dreadnought. Saw action in the Spanish-American War. It helped to sink a couple vessels down near Cuba. And then it was used as a gunnery practice ship and a Naval Academy training vessel. It was decommissioned in 1919 for the final time. It had actually been decommissioned and recommissioned to be used as a training ship and then decommissioned again. And finally, it was towed to Pensacola in 1921 to be used for target practice. And it's actually offshore, a couple miles out of the pass. There's a bell buoy that marks it today, but it's only in about 30 feet of water on a white sand bottom, so it's a really lovely dive site. And here's some photos of Massachusetts when she was afloat. She was a really big, bad battle wagon for her day. She had 2 big 13-inch gun turrets, fore and aft. She had 4 8-inch turrets. She had torpedo tubes in the bow. She had a whole range of small weapons. She was really massive for her time and one of the most powerful vessels afloat. Unfortunately, she just became obsolete pretty quickly. Here she is off Pensacola, and her story of being sunk there is pretty interesting. The Navy actually gave her to the Army to be used for target practice. The Army had this idea that they would put big guns on rail-mounted cars, and that way they could run them around the coast real fast to wherever the nation might be threatened, and they wanted to test this theory. And they needed an obsolete battleship to do it. So they towed it to Pensacola. They sank it on the east side of the pass, and then in typical Army fashion decided that was not where they wanted her, so they had to raise her, move her over to the west side of the pass, and they sunk her again. And then they commenced to shell her. Y'all know where Massachusetts Avenue is up right in town, right? That's why it's called Massachusetts Avenue. That's where the guns were that fired on this thing. And there's wonderful stories of these enormous shells hurtling over the city and breaking the windows and the buildings downtown. And the bottom right photo there is a picture of Massachusetts being shelled, and you can see it's taken from the deck of a little snapper fishing vessel that's really too close. And but they just, they shelled the snot out of her, And then the Army patted itself on the back and said, oh yes, we can in fact sink an enemy battleship, and away they went. And left Massachusetts there, and it became a very popular fishing site because it's out in the Gulf. Obviously you can see where it is. And you can go out and you can fish there. And you can actually get on it. Now, this top left photo is wonderful. Folks out there fishing for snapper. They're standing on one of those 13-inch gun turrets. So it was a wonderful kind of picnic spot. There's also stories of kids going out there at night and kind of having parties, which my parents would never let me do. But it sounds like a pretty fun thing. Today, she's still there. Most of the 8-inch turrets have fallen off over succeeding years. She was also the target of a scrap metal drive during World War II, which took a lot of her scrap metal. And in 1956, actually, a salvage company decided they wanted to come in and salvage the whole thing, at which point the people of Pensacola took that salvage company to court and said, no, we like Massachusetts, we like going out fishing there, and we want to keep it there. And so as a result, the state of Florida was actually awarded title to the vessel in 1956, which is very unusual because normally the Navy does not give up title to any of its vessels anywhere for any reason, but this is kind of an exception. Today it's within the Fort Pickens Aquatic Preserve, and in 1993 it was designated as Florida's 4th underwater archaeological preserve on the 100th anniversary of its launch. And so you can go out there today and dive it. It's a wonderful sight. It's about 350 feet long, chrome nickel steel. It's like an underwater mountain climb. It's really fascinating. Lots of sea life. The top, what you see there, is 1910 refit plans. And then on the bottom is what it looks like today. So you can see a lot of her is still there. Some of it's kind of fallen off to the sides, but it makes for a really fascinating dive. And in fact, there's a guide that you can get at some of the local dive shops or download it from online. And you can take a self-guided tour around the site and look at all of these features that are noted on the guide there. And then to finish up, this is a shipwreck that we're currently researching, just learning some new information about. San Pablo. A lot of you may have heard of the Russian freighter offshore. It's a very popular dive site. It was one of my first dives when I learned to dive 20 years ago. And it's in about 80 feet of water. It's a fantastic dive, and I only ever knew it as a Russian freighter. That's what I was told. But it turns out it was involved in a really interesting operation. It has a long history, built in Belfast in 1915. She operated as a fruit transport. She hauled bananas from South America, and was actually sunk by a U-boat off Costa Rica early in World War II. Well, she was raised but determined to be unfit for service, and somehow acquired by the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA, who told her to Pensacola. Here's where she is. She's quite a ways, about 10 miles offshore, south-southeast, again in about 75, 85 feet of water. So pretty far offshore there, pretty much out of sight of land. And in an operation called Operation Campbell, the OSS blew her up. The idea was that, you can see it was a joint OSS AAF project, and it's the cover of the declassified report. And the idea was that in order to sink enemy vessels in harbor, they would take decoy or dummy vessels that looked like whatever the local fishing craft was, so maybe a Mandalay wood boat or a Cantonese harbor boat. They would dress this dummy boat up to look like a local vessel. They would fill it full of explosives. They would put a dummy at the tiller to look like somebody was driving it. And then they would guide it by remote control up to the enemy vessel using an airplane up above and remote controlling this vessel. And then when it hit the enemy vessel, it would actually kind of stick like a long harpoon in it almost that would set up a charge in the dummy, which would cause it to sink. It was still attached. It would get underneath the enemy vessel, and then the second load of explosives would blow and would blow the vessel up. So it was a fantastic idea, and it actually worked. Here in Pensacola, they used a Copenhagen fishing vessel, and an A2 Hacker craft was the missile vessel, loaded with 3,400 pounds of Torpex, and it was remote controlled from a B-17 that was circling above. When it hit San Pablo, it made an enormous, you can see the shock wave there. These are wonderful photos of the time. It was very successful. It sunk San Pablo, and but for whatever reason, the OSS decided not to use it in battle. So it was an idea that was successful, but was, for whatever reason, was never used. But it was really a fascinating idea, and we have the remains, of course, of San Pablo today. And if you dive it, if you've been on it, you know that it's just masses of twisted wreckage. There's some big boilers that are still there. The refrigerator coils from when its days as a fruit hauler are still on the bottom. But there's a massive kind of chunk out of the side of it, and I just heard from a diver friend that off to the side, as far out as like 200 yards, there's like a debris field from where this explosion went off. So as I mentioned, it's never been archaeologically recorded, although just recently I understand one of the grad students at UWF is going to take it on for a thesis topic. So we will get some good recordings, some histories. We'll be able to tie its history and its archaeology together. I think it'd be really cool if we could identify remains of that dummy vessel, maybe kind of underneath some of the other wreckage. That'd be so cool. So anyhow, so maybe when we can get some more information on this, I can come back and tell you more about San Pablo, because it's got a really fascinating history. Incidentally, San Pablo is part of the Florida Panhandle Shipwreck Trail, which is a series of 12 vessels between here and Port St. Joe that are interpreted for divers. And there's, back here on the table, there's brochures on the Shipwreck Trail, which has got the website address on it if you want to check those out. They all have wonderful videos. You can kind of take a virtual dive on them, including San Pablo. And then there's also information on Massachusetts as an underwater archaeological preserve. And I think for our tour of Pensacola shipwrecks, that's about all I have for you this evening. I could go on for a while. There's about 300 ships wrecked in Pensacola, we know from historical documents. And again, they won't let me drain the bay. But we do know quite a bit about quite a few of them, and primarily through the archaeological research that the state of Florida and the University of West Florida has performed through the years. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out, and I'll be around if you have any other questions, and please feel free to take a look at the stuff on the tables here. Thank you.